Hi all, let's look at the amazing Game 4 in the World Chess Championship, which occurred yesterday, the 12th of November 2014. So Magnus Carlsen kicked off with e4. Vishy seemed to be making a fighting statement. He played the Sicilian defence, one of the most aggressive replies possible to e4. So c5, knight f3, and now we have the move e6. And now Magnus doesn't play the most usual move, which is the open Sicilian. He actually tried perhaps to play in a less theoretical manner, less critical, perhaps fearing some deep preparation from Vishy Anand. He played actually g3. It's quite a rare move, g3, in live book to play here. About the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th most popular move actually in this position, g3. Okay, so we have knight c6, bishop g2, and early d5. So Vishy not fearing e takes d5 with a possible targetable pawn on d5. Quite common in this position is actually knight f6, a little bit more common, where here actually d6 is often used instead of d5. But yeah, we have this d5. Magnus took, and we have e takes d5. This is by far the most popular move. Instead of taking with the queen, to take with the pawn. White usually plays d4 in this position, but Magnus actually played castles, the second most popular, after knight f6, now d4, so transposing back. So this position, black is risking having the dreaded isolated queen's pawn. It's a double-edged sword, the isolated queen's pawn. It does support the e4 square. It's maybe a long-term liability in the position, but it can give black good piece play. Vishy plays bishop e7, and often white does play now d takes c5 in this position, but Magnus played bishop e3, not fearing something like knight g4. I don't think there'd be much point of knight g4 here. This wasn't played, but here just bishop f4, white should be okay. So bishop e3, and now the central tension is resolved. Vishy played c takes d4. After knight takes d4, clearly this is an isolated queen's pawn now, but black's bishops and rooks maybe are going to be active later, and this is quite a nuisance move, bishop g4, trying to provoke a weakness with f3, which would weaken this diagonal, but Magnus stays pretty solid here. He plays actually queen d3. We have queen d7 now, which looks to have potential ideas of bishop h3 maybe one day in the future. Also it helps contest that f5 square. We have knight d2, black castles. Now knight 2 to f3, so white is pretty solidly blockading black's isolated queen's pawn for the moment. But black has this nice square e4 marked out by the IQP, and also c4. These two key squares might be useful to black one day. Maybe a knight one day can come to c4. We have rook fe8, pretty sensible looking move. Not wanting to trade bishops right here, this might not be as useful if black had played, for example, bishop h3. In fact, white might be able to get a marked advantage here with taking knight e5. This is a bit of a liability to do this bishop h3 here. It's backfiring after knight takes c6, so it'll actually be losing for black potentially. So yeah, for the moment black needs to play very carefully in this position, not overload the queen. So rook fe8, very sensible move. Rook fe1, and now bishop d6. So not putting the bishop more passively on f8, but rather this is a potentially more aggressive diagonal, especially if white were to weaken the dark squares here with something like h3 in the future. If that became possible, then this bishop would be very nice on this diagonal. Okay, so here we see the move c3, and now this move helps solidify that d4 control, rules out things on b4, and makes a statement that maybe c4 is less likely in the future. It's just trying to fix this pawn, keep it fixed. We have h6 now. So taking away potential use of g5 from white, like bishop g5s in the future, might have been significant. Now a very curious looking move, very elegant looking move. Queen retreating here, which supports the idea potentially of h3 to nudge the bishop away from g4. The bishop voluntarily ahead of this plays bishop h5. So going to g6 would support black's e4 control, and in fact h3, as though it was attacking the bishop just drops back here anyway in advance of any further attack on the bishop. And it looks as though maybe f5 is an interest point for white in the future. For the moment though, this d file is very interesting. Rook ad1 is played, and you see this X-ray attack potentially, which could be significant in the future of the game. Rook ad8, and in fact in this position this move knight takes c6, letting black seemingly repair his structure, but isolating this pawn if takes. The most logical reply is played b takes c6, so seemingly getting rid of that IQP but fracturing a bit the structure like that, the a7 pawn. And now here Magnus plays c4, so this X-ray attack is becoming more evident on the queen. Nuisance tactics perhaps are going to be possible. Bishop e4, bishop d4, threatening to double black's pawns. Black avoids this now with knight h7. I think this is one of the better moves here. If bishop e7, for example, well, I think this might be okay as well, but it seems a bit on the passive side. It's nice to keep the bishop here just in case on that diagonal. So knight h7, and the knight might have some prospects later, either like this or coming round like this. C takes d5, bishop takes d5. This is a critical point. It looks as though white would be tempted to move one of these pawns. In fact, Magnus avoids doing so. He plays rook takes e8, and here if queen takes e8 it might be slightly advantageous for white to consider something like this, perhaps, you might think. I'm not sure tactically. It looks as though it's lucrative to go after the a7 pawn. I mean, this didn't happen anyway, but apparently black might have some interesting resource here, like bishop takes g3, bishop takes f3. Some tactics here could emerge like this. So if rook takes, then there's queen e3 check. So yeah, white has to be careful about going after this fragmented pawn on a7. But yeah, in fact, Vishy played, he didn't go in for any of this anyway. He played rook takes e8, and we have now queen d3, and the knight centralizes now, knight f8, knight h4, looking at that f5 square, which has been slightly compromised. When h6 is played, it's more difficult to kick a knight away from f5. In this position, you might wonder, well, is this a2 pawn ever on here? It's not really, because in this position there will be bishop takes g7. Actually, we're on d6, so that d file pressure is evident in the variations. Black actually plays bishop e5, and now Magnus plays bishop takes d5. It seems black could capture either way here, but I think taking with the queen is slightly better. If c takes d5, this wasn't played, but if c takes d5, we're back to the IQP, and this would be quite comfortable for white, this position, a comfortable blockade. So Vishy instead, he takes with the queen, and we have some more simplification. Bishop takes, queen takes, looking at b3, and now a pawn does finally move. So white's got a slightly better queenside pawn structure, slightly more fragmented for black, slightly more active knight at the moment. Small advantage for white. Knight e6, knight f3. Queen just drops back to f6 here. It could have also played to maybe a5, but f6 was preferred. King g2. And Magnus doesn't mind clearly an exchange of rooks. Rook d8, queen e2. Now here, yeah, the exchange of rooks isn't so bad for black. Black should be able to hold that position, but instead Vishy plays rook d5. He'd prefer this pawn to come to the centre. It would be looking to be a more dangerous passed pawn there, without any adjacent pawn to stop it in its tracks if it was taken. Nevertheless, Magnus does take it. C takes. So is this a strength or reliability, this pawn? This is a question now being tested. Knight e5 is played. And here, yeah, it looks as though the queen's giving herself a responsibility for the knight, and you might want to test that here with knight d4. In the game, though, queen f5 was played. If knight d4, queen e3, knight c2, it gets a little bit tricky. Is there a perpetual attack? But actually, queen c3, and there doesn't seem to be a perpetual attack, and white can carry on from this position maybe. You know, it's pretty tricky stuff, even in this simplified position. But that really wasn't tested, knight d4. It seems a plausible idea. But queen f5 was played. Knight d3. And now knight d4, as though there's some coordination on f3 here that white needs to be careful with. Yeah, and it looks as though it's like getting on the dangerous side here in this position. If Magnus had played queen d1, it looked as though there was some danger here with queen e4 check. Getting a bit strange why Magnus would want this position. f3, queen e3. This looks pretty strange. But apparently this position is okay for white. The queen's actually quite good on d1, and d5 is put under scrutiny. This position, yeah, white could play on. But it's unclear if he actually has an advantage in real terms. It's an unclear situation. But an astonishing move was played here after knight d4 instead of queen d1. A viable alternative, just g4, kicking black's queen. So trying for an endgame edge of some sort. If knight takes e2 had been played, then here it's interesting that the white king might be able to walk aggressively to d4 if black's not careful. It will require very careful play from black. Say here, then knight takes a2. So you know white has to be white has to be careful. Volume a bit too high there. So this position, say knight b4, it should be okay for black, you'd think, but it looks as though, you know, white's king is quite menacing if it comes out like this. For example, like this. But apparently there might be enough to hold from the dimension perspective, you know, up to a certain depth. It's very interesting, this g4, inviting further simplification. But Vishy actually chose to keep the queens on a bit longer. He actually played queen d7. It also seems that queen e4 might be equal-ish, or is it? Here, maybe this is a slight mistake. Takes knight c5, and actually the point of g4 is revealed. There's no f5, so no, this would be falling into a trap. Queen e4 would be a trap. So yeah, the queen either taking it seems viable or moving the queen away. So Vishy put it on d7, and we have queen e5, and there's still a certain amount of pressure on black, but I think most GMs would agree a draw here. It doesn't seem as though it should be a big deal, but Magnus plays on, king g3. So getting away from tactical ideas of knight f4 check in some lines, king going here, and maybe useful later in this endgame scenario. So queen b5. We have knight f4, and we have some further simplification. Knight takes, king takes. Is the king really a fighting piece in this position? Check. King drops back, and now Vishy pushes the pawn here, which is potentially dangerous. I mean, is it a strength or reliability? The queen's also got access to d2, and if d3, you'd think this is quite aggressive with that pawn. We have check. It does sacrifice though the f7 pawn. And in this position, it shows actually this needs to be very precisely played. It looks very tempting indeed to play queen c3 check here, But actually this might leave white with a significant advantage, believe it or not. In the game Queen D2 was played, which I believe is one of the most accurate moves in the position. If Queen C3 check, then King E4, and then here it's pretty tricky. If D3, Queen F3, check, we can take the pawn. It starts to get a bit tricky. If Queen E1, we take the pawn. Yeah, it just starts to get tricky basically, this position. I think there's some other ideas, but King E4 is a key move here. It just seems, how does black actually make progress here? It seems very tricky indeed. This pawn, is it really going anywhere? Not really. It's so basically, yeah, Queen D2, more accurate it seems, putting the queen in front of the pawn, but going after these two guys potentially. We have check, King H8. And now H4, as though G5 and G6 are on the cards to try and weave a sort of mating net with the queen. Now here again, it seems D3 might be a major mistake in light of this, and this wasn't played because G5 is quite dangerous. For example, like this, we have this position where G6 is dangerous, and even if black queened, then there'll be mate. This would be a very dangerous position. Queen E8, and we have the queen coming back for the pawn. And in these resulting situations, it seems as though white's always slightly better, even if black, sacrificed here. White's slightly better in this ending. It's going to be a pawn up. So yeah, a very, very tricky position. So Vishy again is being tested here after H4. These G5, G6 ideas. And there's also, if any takes, there's ideas of using the H file. So actually black played queen takes A2. So going after this one as well, Queen E6, holding B3, and it looks as though this plan's still on the cards. But now black reverts to interest in the D pawn and checks around here, checking possibilities like this. Check, and now we have a perpetual check in the end. Behind the scenes, there were a lot of variations where white was pressing a small advantage, persistent advantage in the endgame. So Vishy did well to play seemingly counterintuitive moves at points to go after these pawns versus trying to pursue his pawn. Some very tricky decisions needed to be made. A fascinating struggle. Okay, so the match is still level. I hope you enjoyed this. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.